some of these terms that we put up here, when I think, you may not believe it, but yes, I was born and raised really kind of at the cusp after Vatican II. But growing up as a child, up until I was a freshman in high school, I would say that we celebrated the sacrament, or we went to confession, because I don't think I ever remember hearing someone say we celebrated the sacrament. But we went to confession according to the model that I would say that was prior to Vatican II, what's called the order of the sacrament prior to Vatican II. Kind of the images of, we did put up here, where we did here, screen lines, boxes, darkness. I mean, when I think of reconciliation or confession, that's what I think of. Standing in line every Sunday. Our family had the tradition, you went to confession every Sunday before the Mass began. And you walked into a dark room, you knelt down, and you waited for the magic door to slide across. And those are my images, as well as the Hail Marys that we had. I was ordained a priest in 1988, so this summer I'll celebrate 20 years as a priest. Certainly being schooled from 1982 to 1988, the order that we studied was the present order that you are able to celebrate today. But I think it's important to see, when you look at some of these terms or feelings, thoughts, might be in some way more associated with the order of the sacrament prior to Vatican II. I heard a lot about, prior to Vatican II, about judgment. Lots. Now, this aspect is still involved in the present sacrament. But you hear much more, or I heard much more about this. Certainly, I would experience in realms of working with children especially, and teenagers, there's still anxiety, but I think there's a lot about mercy. There's a lot about peace today that I think, 40 years ago, I didn't hear it as much. Certainly didn't experience it. Okay? Not to say that it wasn't there. But you could say the same about the Eucharist. The Eucharist, prior to Vatican II, when someone referred to the Mass, they always referred to as the holy sacrifice, a sacrificial meal. Now, we didn't necessarily call it a meal. That was language that began to come out after Vatican II. And why did all that? And why all of this is correct. It applied to before, and certainly applies to today. I think the one aspect here that I would say that really we hear a lot more about today, conversion. There's counseling in realms of the sacrament. This is really a new one. Scripture. You did not find that in the rite or the order of the sacrament prior to Vatican II. Even prayer. Not to say that it wasn't a prayer, but in a formal way, as we'll go through it, is that there is a possibility where the priest can pray with you prior to even starting the celebration of the rite of penance. So some of these applied before, and I think still some apply today. And I think we need to be careful that we don't ever say that what was done before, in the past, was wrong. I think we need to be careful that we don't do that. Sometimes I hear people say, well, that's the old church. Vatican II is the new way. Well, be careful. Because Vatican II pulls from the old, continues to pull along. It does heighten certain aspects today, like I mentioned, of conversion. I wouldn't say that I'd hear a lot about conversion prior, but it was always there, perhaps disguised. When the Second Vatican Council was going to be held in the early 1960s, when Pope John the 23rd chose to call the council, convene the council, one of the things that he said was that we need to open the doors of the church, and in a sense, my own words, we need to let some fresh air in. A couple of things we need to do as we do that. We need to review and look at how all of the sacraments of the church are celebrated. But we also need to look at all the rites of the church. Why do I say rite? Because the celebration of, there are some like the funeral rite. It's not a sacrament, but it is a rite of the church, an R-I-T-E. And so the council said, we need to look at all of the rites and the sacraments of the church. So by doing that, we need to look at them historically. How did they begin? So we need to look at history of our church of 2,000 years. We also need to look at Scripture. And where in Scripture do we find these sacraments or rites? Did we just create them? Are they rooted in Scripture? We say that we are a church of Scripture and tradition. So where are they? How can we see them? We need to look at history, we need to look at Scripture, and we need to look at the liturgical sources. When the early church was beginning, how were those liturgies or rites being celebrated? Way before you had the order of Mass. How was the Eucharist being celebrated? Did everybody celebrate it differently? Was there a commonality to it? We need to go back and look. And what we began to find out, as we began to look at that, one, we began to find out from Scripture, okay, where do we find it? Because if you remember at the Council of Trent, when there was that tension between the Catholic Church and then what began to be what we call the Reformers, that there was a tension that you in the Catholic Church, all you're worried about is the sacrament. You're a church of sacraments. Where we, those of us who are the Protestant Reformers, or the Reformers as they would refer to themselves, we need to be rooted in Scripture. So the church needed to look and say, okay, how can we defend and say, no, the sacrament of penance is rooted in Scripture? Where do we find it? So Scripture needed to look at, and the liturgical sources, how are they being celebrated? And what we began to find out is that the sacraments, all of them, including penance, is a sacrament that has evolved over time and over history. But you could say that about any of the sacraments. The way you celebrate Mass today at Margaret Mary is not the way it was celebrated in the first 3 centuries. I hate to shock you, but it wasn't. It just wasn't. And how it was celebrated here at Cedar Park, if you're looking back in the first 3 centuries, it was probably celebrated differently at Vincent de Paul. And the church allowed some of that. Okay? So when we began to look back, the church said, well, where do we find the origins of the sacrament of penance or reconciliation?